From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
Massachusetts politics just got a lot more interesting. Sources close to Congressman Joe Kennedy confirm he's considering a 2020 primary challenge against U.S. Senator Ed Markey, raising the prospect of a titanic clash inside the Democratic Party. And he's not the only one. Former New Bedford Mayor Scott Lang has also openly discussed a run against Markey. This week on Newsmakers, Scott Lang discusses his plans, and a political roundtable looks at whether Kennedy will jump in.
Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Ted Nesi. Always good to have you with us. Tim White is off this week. Well, as I said later on in the show, we're going to talk about Congressman Kennedy's surprise. It's not an announcement quite yet, but the word coming out that he's looking at the primary. But before Kennedy got there, someone else had already been talking about the idea of a primary run against Senator Markey next year, and that is former New Bedford Mayor Scott Lang. Mayor, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Ted, for having me.
Good to have you. So, I guess the first question is the obvious one. Are you going to run?
Well, I'm looking at it seriously, and I had a time frame of very early in the year, and people smarter than me talked me out of that and said, wait and see what develops, and I'm glad I did. But I've actually been looking at this race for about a year and a half. Because
Why?
I felt I'm not for coronations, and I think that someone needs to, or many people need to, challenge Senator Markey regarding his record, his performance as senator over the last 6 years, and one of two things will happen. Either someone else will get the nomination or he'll be a better senator for it. But this idea of last time he wasn't challenged, he'd just been senator for a short period of time. This time I felt it was important. I also think it's important from a national Democratic Party perspective. I think the party's begun to stray away from the reasons that people vote for it on a traditional basis, and it's important to get back to talk about some of those issues. Some of the issues people talk about every day in their own homes, we need to talk about, and we need to. Identifying problems is easy, coming up with solutions is tough.
You're a Democrat. You've been a Democrat a long time. You worked on, I think, Ted Kennedy's 1980 presidential campaign.
But before that, on Hubert Humphrey's.
And even before that, you're aging yourself.
Yeah, I was right. I was when I was born. They said you're a Democrat, you know.
So, and to that point, though, Senator Markey's allies say, "Hey, wait a minute. He's a loyal Democrat. He's served the party for 4 decades now in Congress. He votes the right way with the party on big issues and such. What is, the substance of your critique of how he's handling his Senate seat?"
So I want to say I respect him. I admire him. I admire the idea that he's been in public service for 40 years. But I think he's out of touch with Massachusetts. I think, first of all, you have to be in Massachusetts. You have to be visiting all the cities and towns on a regular basis, not just during the election period. You have to understand what the town's priorities are, the city's priorities are. Go to Washington, articulate them, and bring back the federal largesse, whatever it might be, in whatever form. It could be a grant, it could be direct aid, it might be some sort of resources. But the fact is, you serve the people of this state, and you need to be in touch with them. It's not a debating society. It doesn't make a lot of sense to duel with little wooden swords down in Washington against Mitch McConnell when you don't know exactly what the people of the state want from the U.S. Senator. We had great U.S. Senators in our history, and when I was mayor, we had Senator Kennedy, who by and far knew every street light in New Bedford, Senator Kerry, who backed him up. You made a phone call, you understood that they knew what you were talking about. They carry the ball for the people of your city or the people of the state. We need to see that again. Constituent services is part of being a senator. In addition, there are issues that face people today that really are basic gut issues. And talking about things that are very important over the next several generations is part of being a senator. But identifying everything from educational issues that affect us now, everything from the student loan crisis itself, but also the failing schools that we have in many parts of the state, are things that a U.S. Senator can help out on. The opiate addiction issue is one that we need federal help on a regular basis. That's a crisis in our state and many states, but in our cities and towns, the gateway cities have been hit hard. You can see I'm all for talking about global warming. Global warming is really important. We've changed global warming. It's now morphed into climate change. It's morphed into severe weather, whatever. But we have some real issues. But let's come up with concrete, doable solutions rather than sitting here talking about the next.
Well, you're referring, of course, to the Green New Deal, which Senator Markey's been the Senate sponsor, and of course Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez on the House side. That I've seen just in the week since Kennedy's talk. That is a thing that's welding Senator Markey to progressives who are proud of his being way out front on that issue. But it sounds like you don't necessarily agree.
I think that Markey has a tremendous amount of credentials in the field of the environment. I have no doubt about it. But wedding yourself as a U.S. Senator to the Green New Deal when it was literally, in the way it was presented, which was the equivalent of a term paper that was not vetted out appropriately, took the currency that he has, the credibility that he has, and I think really put him in a situation where he's defending something that can't be defended on its four corners. We have to attack the problem. We have to come up with realistic solutions. We've got to do something on carbon immediately. But getting into the Green New Deal, which has three components, and each component is more and more brings you more and more closer to nirvana, is not how people are going to vote. And what it did was become a foil immediately for the Republicans to say, look at this. I mean, you had McConnell do the stunt where he asked for votes, a vote on the Senate floor. And the people who supported it voted present. If you really believe in it, if you're really going to fight for it, at a certain point, then I expect you to carry it forward. I don't want gimmicks. I don't want things that are the next great thing or the next headline. Let's do the job day in and day out. And that's what I have a problem with. We don't need a national senator. We have one in Senator Warren who's running for president. We need someone who's tied to the people of the state, who understand you're down there. It's a lunch bucket job. It's not a glamour job. It's not a celebrity job. It's let's get this done. Let's move forward.
So, as I mentioned, you were talking about running against Senator Markey well before Congressman Kennedy's interest became public, but we now know he is thinking hard about it. We don't know what he's going to decide. Do you think Kennedy should run?
I do think Kennedy should run. I also can tell you that if Kennedy runs, I don't know that there's enough oxygen in the race other than you coming back and saying, so what do you think? To support other candidates, quite honestly. But we need a race. The Democratic Party and democracy is better when people who have expertise, who have the ability to discuss important issues, get in, define their positions, start talking about what might be common ground, start talking about what's realistic. And I think that would be very important. And Senator Kennedy's nephew, Joe, who I met when he was a young kid, I think has a tremendous future in the party and as a leader of the country. I think Markey's been there for 40 years. He certainly has the credentials. The two of them debating and running in a Senate primary, I think would be very good for the state and good for the party.
When are you going to make a decision, and how will Kennedy's calculus affect yours, if at all?
If Representative Kennedy runs for this office, it's unlikely that I would run. I'd certainly not keep my powder dry and certainly talk about issues that I think are important and try and drive the debate and I'm looking for progressive centrists. All right, so people who can forge alliances, bipartisan solutions, but are progressive on social issues, that understand right from wrong, that understand what's happening in our country today. You can't sit down and be quiet about what's happening in our country today and then 5, 10, 15 years from now ask, how did we lose our democracy?
I want to ask you to handicap a little. You were mayor from 2005 to 2011 in Bedford, one of the biggest cities in the state, and I believe you never lost a precinct in your time running for mayor in the city. But play it out. If there is a primary between Senator Markey and Congressman Kennedy, where do you think Democratic primary voters would end up? There is an incumbent there, and incumbency usually is an advantage, but of course he's a candidate.
So let's take away the Kennedy factor. I think that I would give Senator Markey a very tough race based on the issues, based on connectivity to what people are talking about. From Pittsfield over to P-Town, fill in from New Bedford, Fall River, all the gateway cities, up to the northern border. I think that I would resonate with the people because I think I understand that they want to know, what are you doing with the economy? What are you doing with public safety? What are we doing with opioids? What are we going to do with health care? What are we doing with immigration? And not have it all be a slogan. Actually sit down, peel the onion and say, this is the nub of the issue. Let's figure out how we resolve it. We were close to an immigration bill and it was scuttled basically by ideologues, screaming during Bush's term. Right, and then we've lost it completely. Let's get back and figure out. You can't be the Democratic Party that says we'll have open borders. You can't be the Democratic Party that says we'll abolish public health insurance companies. You can't be the Democratic Party that tells you we're going to figure out a way to redistribute the wealth, and it begins to border on people saying, well, that's socialism. We do. It's funny.
Some people are going to say you sound like a dino, Democrat in name only, that you're getting too conservative.
And I think what it comes down to is just about every position that I would take is a traditional liberal Democratic Party position. And I don't think that the people, I don't believe that in labels of left or right, but I certainly don't consider myself to be in the Bernie Sanders camp, which I always thought Bernie Sanders, who I like very much, is a socialist. I don't think that we need to tap dance to the far extremes in order to be able to govern and represent people. Most people don't even think to the level that they want any kind of major change. They want an incremental change that represents the best for their family, for their kids going forward. And the idea that we've turned into a debating society where someone says, if you're for Medicare for all, raise your hand, and half the candidates raise their hand, I'm not even sure that people understand what Medicare would be for all and what it means. We know we have people who are uninsured. We know that co-pays, premiums, and deductibles are too high. I don't think that means scuttling the entire system and saying, okay, let's start again. We just got through Affordable Care Act. It certainly needs to be tweaked. It certainly needs maybe overhaul. But the idea that we're somehow trying to find ourselves again doesn't make sense to me.
So we're running short on time. Scott Lang, if Joe Kennedy does not run, does that mean you're running for Senate?
If Kennedy doesn't run by October 1, I'll make that decision.
And you think you can run a full, credible, well-funded campaign? I mean, Markey has, I think, $4 million.
Yeah, no, I know I can. I think ideas and energy, and I think getting out around the state, I don't think money is going to be a problem. I also can tell you that I put specific caps on it, like when I ran for mayor, and I would basically run a campaign that doesn't have us involved in a situation where you're asking me, why did you take money from this person or that person? If you want good government, I'd take money. If there's any other reason, I wouldn't take it.
All right, former New Bedford Mayor Scott Lang, we're going to keep an eye on your future plans as the fall develops. Stick with us, though, because when we come back, we have a great political panel to break down what is going on with this wild, already U.S. Senate primary in Massachusetts. Stick with us on Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Ted Nesi, filling in this weekend for Tim White, who is off for a well-deserved vacation. And pleased to be joined today by two people who know Massachusetts politics very well and are going to guide us through this late summer intrigue that we're seeing here. Scott Ferson, he is the founder of the Liberty Square Group in Boston, a key strategy firm up there that has worked with a lot of candidates over the years. And Shannon Jenkins, she's a political science professor at UMass Dartmouth, and actually, she's been on the show before, just returned from Japan, where she had a sabbatical, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. It was great.
You said their public transport's in a bit better shape than the Bay States.
A little bit, just a little,
just a few things. Maybe we'll send Governor Baker over for some tips. So first, Scott, I'll ask you to react to Scott. What, just your reaction to Scott Lang's critique of Senator Markey you heard off the top there?
Yeah, and I think Senator Markey's been a very effective senator, but I completely agree with Mayor Lang that democracy's good. I mean, I helped Seth Moulton challenge John Tierney in 2014, and to the mayor's point, I worked for Senator Kennedy during his race in '94 with Mitt Romney, and I think it made him a better senator. So there's nothing wrong with democracy.
Yeah. Shannon, your thoughts?
Yeah, and I mean, particularly in the Massachusetts, right, there's basically no Republican Party except, for gubernatorial campaigns. And so if we're going to see competition, which the political science research is pretty clear that competition is good, it's going to have to come in a Democratic primary. And there's been a lot of people have often been told, this is sort of a tradition in Massachusetts policy, to be told to wait your turn. But I think Massachusetts politics becomes better when people don't wait their turn.
I think incumbents like people to wait their turn.
Correct, and party insiders and that sort of thing. And so I think it makes us all better. I would agree with both Scotts on this point, that competition is good.
And that's a good point, Shannon, that in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, two very blue states where the Democrats nearly always win any state or federal election in the end when November comes, if you don't have primary competition for these big offices, you're not going to have challenges that actually frequently that make the incumbent sweat.
Right, yeah, and so it's important, I think, for Democratic candidates to come out and to contest primaries.
So we've got to talk about Joe Kennedy and what's going on here. I've spoken to people around him. He's absolutely serious about considering this. They are not saying he's definitely running, and they say he's got a couple weeks of flirtation and thinking to go before he decides. I was somewhat surprised, Scott. Joe Kennedy, I've covered him since he first ran. His district is a key part of Southeast New England here, and he's never seen the assassin
assassin type. He's famously the Kennedy who drinks milk, and all that. But he's really serious about this. What was your reaction, Scott? I should say you did work for Ted Kennedy, so you know the Kennedys. What was your reaction when you heard Joe was seriously thinking about this?
I first think if you drink milk, that's disqualifying for being in the United States Senate. But I agree with you that I've said this as well, that I think the next open Senate seat was for Joe Kennedy. But I think it's a sign of the times, both not only the disruption that's happening in politics now with people kind of not waiting their turn, but I also think because I know how much Congressman Kennedy cares about particularly equity issues in Washington and this administration. So I'm sure him looking at being effective as one of 435 members of Congress, or him being effective as one of 100 senators, the impact is just a lot more. And so in that respect, I'm not surprised that he's taking a look at it. Why wouldn't you take a look at it, I think?
And Shannon, same question. When you heard the news and realized this was a serious possibility, what did you think?
I mean, I have to say I was surprised, right? Coming back in and being sort of greeted with this news in the first week back, it was surprising. But in a certain sense, I think it makes sense if you want to make that next step into the Senate. You have to think about, right, politicians are strategic, the best politicians. When is your next opportunity? Markey is an incumbent, but not a lot of people are going to jump in because of that. So you have a much smaller race. If, say, Warren is elected and her seat comes open, well, who might jump into that race? And then you're looking at, maybe Maura Healey, maybe Ayanna Pressley jump into that race. And that becomes a much more difficult race to win in a Democratic primary if you're running against female incumbents of color. Identity politics is important in the Democratic Party right now. And so that becomes a little bit harder. And then even in an open Warren seat, you're looking who's going to run on the Republican side, right? What does Governor Baker do? I mean, there's a lot of indications he's running for a third term potentially, but if there's a Senate seat that's available, well, I don't know, maybe that becomes really attractive. So I think Kennedy's calculus is this might be, even though it's hard to challenge an incumbent, one of his best opportunities to get a Senate seat.
And Markey's kind of the life lesson in this. He was a young man in the hurry. He was 25 years old, I think, when he was elected to Congress in
1976.
In 1976. Right. And then he spent a lot of time in Congress waiting around for that Senate opportunity and took a couple of fits and starts there, and then finally took the plunge into it. So I'm sure Joe Kennedy's looking at it saying,
I don't want to have to wait that long.
I don't want to have to wait that long.
Yeah. Do you think, Scott, that has something, you've been doing campaigns in Mass for a long time. Do you think something has changed in the electorate, or is it more just in the politicians? You worked on Moulton's campaign. He bumped off, not literally, but he took out John Tierney. Ayanna Pressley took out Mike Capuano, who himself had been a progressive vote, but she said it's time, we need a different type of leadership in Washington. Now Kennedy would certainly be a credible threat to Markey. Do you think the voters have changed, or what's changed here?
I think the whole electorate has changed. I mean, when Moulton challenged Tierney, I was sort of surprised by the blowback. Because I actually thought that we believed in democracy in 2014, but less so in the Democratic Party. And people were really, really upset about it. But I think with Ayanna Pressley, people didn't really sort of question that and thought by then, and what had changed in between 14 and 18, Donald Trump in 2016. And I think it really has changed the way that people, a barrier to entry, the way that people are looking at running for races. They're not looking at it in the same calculus anymore, I don't think.
At the same time, Shannon, I could hear some political professionals, mayors, saying, hold on, there's a reason we don't love to have constant open war inside the party, because it divides us and it makes it hard to work strategically to keep the Massachusetts Democratic Party is a very successful electioneering organization. I mean, is there some truth to that?
Sure, but there are ways to run campaigns that are divisive, and there are ways to run campaigns that are not divisive and respectful. And you can run a campaign that becomes not divisive, but that focuses on the issues and gives people some things to think about and choices. And I think that's good. And so competition in itself isn't necessarily bad. It's how that competition occurs. I think the other key thing that I would say to add to Scott's point too, I want to elaborate on is I think particularly when you see Ocasio-Cortez, Pressley, right? They're running in districts that had become a lot more diverse, and America itself is becoming a lot more diverse. And I think there's a lot of people who are frustrated that Congress doesn't represent the diversity of America, and so I think that has paved the way for some of these insurgent candidates, particularly in districts that used to be primarily homogeneous, that are now a lot more heterogeneous. And how that plays out in a statewide Senate seat, I'm not really sure. But that, I think, really helped Ayanna Pressley. I think it also helped Ocasio-Cortez. They were in dense, smaller districts that were much more diverse, and that they were on the ground a lot, the two of them.
And Scott, you saw Markey up close in a Senate race because you worked advised Stephen Lynch, who ran against him unsuccessfully in the 2013 special after John Kerry left. What's your handicap on Senator Markey? Is he ready for a real tough fight? As the 2014 full-term election was not a very hard-fought race.
Mm-hmm. And I think in the 2013 race, he hadn't been. Stephen Lynch had been elected in 2001, had a race, competitive race in 2010. He, I think, and was sort of more in touch with his district. And Ed Markey, really hadn't had a serious challenge for a long time, hadn't been sort of forced to campaign. And I think in 13 he was a quick learner and sort of got back on his feet in that respect. And my observation now is that, and certainly given some of the reaction that you get to, environmentalist progressives coming to his defense against Joe Kennedy, who I think is an environmentalist and progressive, he's been doing the real spade work in the party and getting around and getting in touch with the activists in the party. I think he's been doing a very good job in that respect. So he'll be more prepared this time.
And of course, a lot of our market is in the Massachusetts viewers who have Channel 12 will be in the 4th District, or they're in the 9th District, Bill Keating's. We have a map because I want to give them a sense, because of course if Kennedy runs for Senate, his U.S. House seat opens up, and U.S. House seats don't turn over that often in Massachusetts. So if viewers are looking, the darker purple district with the 4 on it, that's the 4th District on the Rhode Island border. And Shannon, it stretches there from way up there in Newton and Brookline. It was drawn, I'm sure, very without any thought for politics. It was drawn down into the northern part of Fall River through the Attleboroughs, through my homeland there. Where do you see, when you look at a district like that, do you think strong candidates will come out of?
Well, so that's the real challenge of 4, is that it stretches so far. And in drawing those districts, I think the state legislature was really keen to have a lot of the congressional delegation have ties to the Boston metro area. And so you see a lot of those districts pull into the Boston metro. As a result, the district stretches through some really, really liberal areas, down into some conservative areas where
Barney Frank used to call it Utah, around Rentham and Attleboro.
And then down into sort of more working class Taunton and Fall River. And so that's going to be interesting because different candidates appeal to different parts of that electorate. And what always really matters is who shows up to vote come election time. The Massachusetts primary, I forget the date this year, you could probably remind me, but it tends to come pretty...
September
something.
So the state primaries are late, right? And not a lot of people are paying attention. And so you could have a fairly progressive, right, sort of, electorate, and that favors, I'd say candidates probably up in the Brookline area up there. Maybe not. It's really hard to handicap. I do think, Deb Goldberg is said to be really interested in that race, and having a statewide office and a statewide organization. I know she has people in the whole district, so that may advantage her, and she doesn't have to give up her seat.
Right. State Senator Paul Feeney, another one whose district out of Foxborough, who really overlaps quite a bit with the 4th District.
Right. There's a number of state senators who are definitely interested in that seat, and because they have bigger districts, probably have a leg up.
Yeah, Scott, do you think in the end that district's going to be controlled more by its Newton, Brookline, there's a lot of money up there too, along with a lot of votes, or do you think the Taunton, Fall River, Attleboro section of it can control that seat? Yeah,
I mean, having worked on Lynch's and worked in the 3rd, worked in a couple of races. I mean, Larry Trahan, it's very much a Lowell district. Ultimately, in the day when they were, I don't know how many, 700 candidates or something in that race. That here, the bulk of the population is in the top 4 towns in the northern half of the district. But if you get 5-6 candidates out of Newton, Brookline, then does Senator Becca Rausch, who really mined votes out of Attleboro that we had not seen before.
She did.
In a long time.
Richard Ross, I think he was shocked by it. Yeah.
Shocked. Could somebody from the middle part of the district or the southern part of the district, in a crowded field, if they had that all to themselves, there's a path there.
Does it matter, Shannon, putting your political science hat back on, does it matter if I was looking, I put on Twitter the other day a little circle, you could theoretically elect 5 of the 9 Massachusetts Congress members, as you said, out of basically Boston and its suburbs, even though there are plenty of people down in Fall River, down in New Bedford, in the Attleboroughs, out further into the Metro West. I mean, does it matter if the people who are elected, they'll say, I'll visit my district, but in the end, they're living up there in Greater Boston?
Well, I mean, let's put it this way. The state legislature designed the districts to have 5 people, right, or 4 or 5 representatives have a stake in Boston for a reason, right? And so it does matter. And, Yeah, I think in some ways that has frustrated many politicians, local politicians from other parts of the states, that they feel that there is this political gravity towards Boston that sometimes leads to neglect to other areas of the state. So it certainly matters, right? And then it does matter, right, where the ties are and who gets elected in the 4th.
All right, 30 seconds left. Do you think Kennedy runs, Scott?
I think he's far out enough over his skis. It's hard to pull back. I think he probably at this point has to pull the trigger.
Shannon?
I don't know. I'm kind of, my gut says
You
no.
just don't want me to play it back in too much.
Well, I'm gun shy after predicting the 2016 election outcome, so I'm shy about making on-camera predictions. My gut says no, but I don't know.
Well, we'll be sure to have the two of you back because it's going to stay interesting. We'll have Scott Lang if we don't have Kennedy, it sounds like, anyway. So it's going to be maybe a more active political year in Massachusetts than we expected. Scott Ferson, Shannon Jenkins, thank you both for being with me, and thank you for being with us this week on Newsmakers. Tim White will be back next week. And remember, you can always catch up with the show on our podcast on iTunes or on WPRI.com. See you back here next week.